Hello, uh, good evening. Uh, I welcome all of you to this clinical grand round on juvenile angiofibroma. We will discuss our experience over last 2 decades. We have divided our talk into four main subsets. The first will be to review the current concepts on anatomical and cellular origin of juvenile angiofibroma and its relevance in its surgical management. Part 2 will be to list the principles of pre-surgical preparation with a special focus on medical and interventional strategies to reduce the vascularity of the tumor and also to select the surgical approach and surgical exuvation in the treatment of angiofibroma. Third part will be to discuss various surgical approaches used in this cases and their techniques. And fourth will be to discuss the research contributions and lessons learned from our own experience in minimizing the tumor recurrences. The speakers will be Dr. Kapil Sikka, Professor Ashu Seth Bhalla from the Department of Radiodiagnosis, Professor Rimi Rewadi from the Department of Anesthesia, Dr. Chirom Amit Singh, Dr. Hitesh Verma, Professor Assis Suri from the Department of Neurosurgery, Dr. Piragu, and Professor Alok Thakkar. And at the end, we will be having a question answer session. Dr. Kapil Sikka, please.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon, everyone. I have been interested in the task of introducing about juvenile angiofibroma tumor. That's the picture. That's a typical presentation of a case of angiofibroma which presents to us. It's a very peculiar tumor that occurs in our practice. This tumor is peculiarly exclusively male tumor. It never occurs in female patients. And the typical patient is a boy who is aged around 13 to 18 years, a typical adolescent tumor. And there have been reports of spontaneous regression of this tumor occurring by the time the patient reaches adulthood. There are certain histological characteristics of this tumor which makes it rather unfavorable undertaking to excise this tumor. As the name suggests, angiofibroma has got fibrous and vascular components in it, and this tumor is very fragile in some cases and is very prone to surgical rupture. And once this tumor ruptures, if you see this photograph, the vessels, they are essentially sinusoidal and they don't have any muscular layer around this. So once this tumor ruptures, they don't have a spontaneous muscle activity to stop that bleeding, and this bleeding doesn't stop. So it's an intensely vascular tumor with open vessels that are very prone to rupture. Tumor is very prone to rupture and can lead to massive hemorrhage, which can at times be very difficult to control. There are other histological peculiarities also. This tumor, in very high percentage of cases, almost more than 90%, 28 cases in our experience, 26, they have expressed some sex hormones on its stromal cells. There are various theories of origin that I described. There is a long random debate on this, but by and large, the origin occurs from this particular region in posterior nasopharynx. This is the sphenoid bone. Some say that tumor arises from region of Vidian canal, and others attribute the origin to sphenopalatine foramen. But this area is almost invariably involved in nasopharyngeal angiofibromas. There are some good things about this tumor. It's a very predictable tumor. The patterns of spread, the location in the head and neck areas is very, very predictable, and it follows very standard patterns of spread, which makes, if it's well understood, then the excision becomes relatively easy. And tumor primary, if it's primary tumor, it has not been violated before, then excision is easy because they do not take attachments anywhere else apart from its sites of origin. Tumor looks like this. You can see the lobulated areas, they don't have attachment anywhere else. They are smooth. You can pull them out, but they, at areas of attachment, they need to be dissected with relevant surgical techniques, which we'll be discussing. Tumor extensions, I'll not be going into details, but I put this slide to highlight the fact that there will be very standard extensions of this tumor. It arises from nasopharynx and extends along infratemporal fossa, and through the inferior and superior orbital fissure, the tumor will enter intracranially. And if it's a small tumor, it will almost always gain its vascular supply from the internal maxillary artery. Again, won't go into details of staging, but this is the staging which we use in our practice. The smaller tumors, that is the 1A tumors, they are limited to nasopharyngeal vault or the posterior nares. And the larger tumors, that is grade 3 or stage 3 tumors, they are extending intracranially with minimal intracranial extension as 3A and extensive intracranial extension graded as 3B. Our institute has contributed immensely to world literature, as well as we have gained our experience and knowledge from world literature, and we have found that Vidian canal in angiofibroma is almost invariably involved. It's almost involved almost in 100% of cases. Our experience that was well published and well cited has shown that 13 out of 16 patients had radiological involvement of Vidian canal. But even if there is no radiologic or clinical involvement, we had studied that in 16 patients where we had excised the tumor completely, it was apparent complete excision of tumor, histological residual was found in 4 out of 16 patients in the Vidian canal area. And thereafter, we have implemented almost uniformly the drilling of pterygoid base, which will be seen in our surgical techniques and videos to reduce the recurrence to almost negligible. Another very impactful study that has come out from our institute is the use of flutamide in pre-surgical volume reduction of angiofibroma. As I already mentioned, it expresses sex hormones on this, and if we are administering anti-androgen drug, that is flutamide, in a dose of 10 mg per kg, 6 weeks pre-surgically, which we are using in almost all cases nowadays, we have seen that if the males are post-pubertal, it leads to a significant regression. Mean regression of 16% and maximum regression as much as 40%. Some will argue that what will happen if you reduce the tumor size by 16%? It has been substantial, it leads to substantial impact. The surgical approach at times you can change. If the patient initially was requiring a very radical surgical approach, you can manage the tumor with less radical surgical approach, less morbidity to the patient, and at times if the tumor is very close to very vital structures like dura, cavernous sinus or carotid artery, even that 15-20% reduction is substantial in reducing morbidity. Very important member of our team, Professor Ashu Seth, will take us through the radiology.
So essentially, I'll cover this in 2 aspects. First, diagnosis, and then intervention part. Now, in diagnosis, as Dr. Kapil has already brought out, a typical age, a typical presentation, striking amount of enhancement, typical location and extension. Extension being the lateral extension, which he showed you when sphenopalatine foramen, then pterygomaxillary fissure and fossa get involved. This we take as indicative of a JNA. Its extension is very classically through foramen widening and not through bone destruction. He already mentioned to the Vidian canal widening, which we have highlighted here better. This is the foramen rotundum, this is the Vidian canal, and you can see the Vidian canal almost destroyed, and even the inferior border of the foramen rotundum is involved. But if you will notice that all the extension is not happening through foramen, and there is a direct destruction of what looks like direct destruction of the middle skull base. So that's where the challenges come. I'll come to that later. On MR, it gives a very intermediate signal on titubated images. But if you see what you see inside, very striking are the flow voids. You can see flow voids because of the vessels. So not only do you have an intense vascularity because of the microvessel density, but you also have large vessels which can be seen inside the tumor, and various fibrous kind of septae which run through it. This is the area which everybody is talking about repeatedly, Vidian canal, because this constitutes the site of the ICA anastomosis in this tumor, so a nightmare for an interventional radiologist also. This is the hugely dilated internal maxillary artery, and this is the supply from the Vidian canal artery, and this provides at the pterygomaxillary fossa the site where these two will anastomose. Imaging features, I already brought out the typical imaging features, but what happens if you see something which is this destructive and most of the aggressive lesions may not show that much intense enhancement. So there are times when you are stuck with diagnosis where we have worked on advanced MR techniques. Actually, diffusion is now around for a long time, so it's not really advanced technique. It's a part of all routine brain and head and neck imaging. But what we found in comparing it to other sinonasal masses is that nothing gives an ADC value as high as JNA. It gave us a mean ADC value of 2.168, and there was no overlap with any other tumor. And we have found this a very striking feature in aggressive tumors where we are not sure. If we get an ADC which is well above 2, we are happy to call it a JNA, because as you know, because of the vascularity, these tumors cannot be biopsied. We are also working on mapping the exact vascularity within the entire tumors, because different part of the tumor has different vascularity. So this is a MR perfusion map which will give you exact quantitative distribution of the vessels. In preoperative distribution, the long-standing method has been transarterial, wherein you usually embolize both the internal maxillary arteries, as these form the dominant supply, and also supply comes from ascending pharyngeal arteries and branches of the facial. But the problem comes because a substantial amount of supply when it comes from the ICA, which in majority of patients will come through the Vidian canal, but anteriorly, as you know, from the ophthalmic is another site of ICA-ECA anastomosis. So you can have retrograde flow through the ophthalmic also. So when we embolize, we do embolize the part which comes from all the ECA branches, but we do not embolize the part which comes through the ICA. So how do we prevent the patient from bleeding peroperatively? Is in 3B tumors, what we 3A, 3B, all advanced tumors, we will go in for transarterial plus an additional percutaneous, where ultrasound and fluoro-guided, we place multiple needles within this tumor, and after placing multiple needles, we do a direct glue injection, while keeping a lookout that there should be no intravasation, because we are dealing with liquid embolic agent into the ICA or its branches. So for transarterial, we use polyvinyl alcohol, but for direct percutaneous method, we use glue embolization. So this is what eventually the glue embolization will look like, and it substantially brings down the blood losses. And this is the report which we give at the end of completing our study of what percentage of tumor supply came from where and what exactly we have used to reduce the vascularity. I invite Dr. Vimy now.
So the anesthetic management of juvenile nasal angiofibromas pose a challenge primarily because of the fact that these are highly vascular tumors with increased blood loss during surgical resection. So essentially, these are young adults with no associated comorbidities, but airway may be of concern in some patients who have large tumors with tumors actually extending into the oropharynx, in which case you have to rule out obstructive sleep apnea as well. These patients need to be counseled extensively for the fact that the endotracheal tube might be kept in situ in the postoperative period, and if they have OSA, then application of CPAP might be needed. Pre-medication usually consists of an anxiolytic and antacid, and it is essential that one should ensure that adequate cross-matched blood and blood products is available. Now, in the operating room, a large bore IV access is essential and mandatory, and the anesthesia is administered using a balanced general anesthetic technique with inhalational agents, opioids, and neuromuscular blocking agents. Or alternatively, one can also use total intravenous anesthesia, where continuous infusions of hypnotic drugs such as propofol with short-acting opioids can be used. The endotracheal tube needs to be secured properly to prevent accidental dislodgement of the tube, because the airway is shared with the surgeons. And after the endotracheal tube has been placed, a good oropharyngeal packing is a must to prevent aspiration of blood both into the lungs as well as into the stomach. Use of warming blankets and fluid warmers is essential to ensure normothermia. Now, intraoperative monitoring consists of the usual ASA monitoring, and besides that, the radial artery or the dorsalis pedis artery is cannulated to have a continuous monitoring of the arterial pressure, and a central venous catheter is placed in the axillary artery or the subclavian artery, or sometimes even the femoral vein, axillary vein or the subclavian vein, and sometimes the femoral vein, to monitor CVP as well as to administer vasopressor drugs. Now we also have the availability of non-invasive and continuous hemoglobin monitoring, which can help us decide about the need of transfusions. Now, the main strategy during the anesthetic management of these tumors is to reduce blood loss and to prevent allogenic transfusions. So, blood loss can be reduced by positioning the patients in 30-degree head-up position, by asking the surgeons to infiltrate local vasoconstrictive agents such as adrenaline and institution of induced hypertension, which I'll come to a little later, and use of autologous transfusion in the form of preoperative donation, which is not really possible most of the times because these patients come in emergency with large bleeds and low hemoglobin. And acute normovolemic hemodilution used to be practiced once upon a time, not practiced too much now because of the advent of the preoperative embolization and endoscopic surgery. The blood loss is not as much, and the more and more it's becoming more and more common to accept a very restrictive transfusion figure of 7 gram%. So we don't really transfuse allogenic blood to these patients. Now, induced hypertension is the mainstay of anesthetic management, where it's a technique where we reduce the blood pressure to a mean arterial pressure of 50 to 65 millimeters of mercury using pharmacological agents. And the advantages are a reduced blood loss as well as a clear surgical field for the surgeon to operate on, especially pertaining to endoscopic surgery, and obviously it translates into a reduced operating time as well. So there are various techniques which can be used to achieve induced hypertension. Commonly used techniques are inhalational agents, higher concentrations like isoflurane, desflurane and sevoflurane. Use of total intravenous anesthesia, especially propofol and remifentanil. Remifentanil is not available in India, so we use fentanyl instead of that. Then direct acting vasodilators like NTG and SNP, but they have a disadvantage of causing reflex tachycardia, which offsets the hypotension. So more commonly we use short-acting beta blockers like esmolol, and in the last 5 years or so we have started using dexmedetomidine, which is the alpha-2 agonist, and magnesium sulfate, which cause both a reduction in heart rate and blood pressure, but also help in deepening the level of the anesthesia, lead to postoperative analgesia as well as reduction in postoperative nausea vomiting. So they have additional advantages. So this is a paper from our department where we looked at the use of magnesium sulfate or diltiazem as adjuvants to total intravenous anesthesia for endoscopic sinus surgery, and we found that it led to significant reduction in blood loss. Now, a word about acute normovolemic hemodilation. What we do here is that we withdraw whole blood from the patient after induction of anesthesia and replace it with crystalloid or colloid solution to achieve normovolemia. So the advantage is that because of the hemodilution, the total red cell mass lost during surgery is less, and the same autologous blood which is collected is then retransfused after the surgery is over. So in the post-operative period, these patients are monitored in the high dependency unit or ICU depending on the patient's condition, and one has to be vigilant about post-operative bleeding. Oftentimes, the endotracheal tube is kept in situ because of various reasons like massive blood loss, which is very rarely seen nowadays, extensive surgical dissection, non-specific oozing, and the most common reason being a postnasal pack in situ, which can lead to obstruction. So endotracheal tube is preferably kept in situ. Analgesia is generally provided with a continuous infusion of IV opioids in combination with paracetamol. Post-operative nausea vomiting is a problem and should be taken care of with ondansetron at regular intervals. Pack removal is generally scheduled for 24 to 48 hours after surgery and should be done in a controlled environment in the operating room in the presence of an anesthesiologist. Thank you.
So after this, the important about we all know that angiofibroma is a benign tumor, and the main treatment is surgery. And if we can excise the tumor as a single block, then that is the preferred surgery. Sometimes surgery may not be possible in all the patients. Tumor may be large enough and it has gone into intracranial, and encasing the carotids and surgery is not possible. In such cases, radiotherapy is an option. So I'll be discussing about the surgical aspects. The preoperative preparations that we have already discussed. Intraoperatively, during the surgery, what we need to have is a good exposure. Whether we are doing open approaches or the endoscopic approaches, we need good exposure is required because we need to define that area of attachment of the tumor. as well as once we have found the attachment area, then we have to remove the tumor by dissecting subperiosteally. And also we should take care that we should not pull the tumor so hard, so that sometimes the tumor embeds into this base of pterygoids area like a finger projections, and when we pull it out, and some part of the tumor may leave behind. So even if you are doing an open approach, it is wise to use endoscopes to look into this critical area so that the tumor excision is complete. Last but not the least, the most important thing is we work as a team while doing this surgery. The surgeon is important, but equal importance is about the good coordination from the assisting doctors, surgeon, as well as the coordination with our anesthetic colleagues and the assisting nurses. So we all know that the tumor arises from this base of pterygoids area in the pterygopalatine fossa, whether it's a Vidian area or whether it's a spinopalatine area. So the attachment is mainly in this area of the skull base, and it can infiltrate into the cancellous bone of this basisphenoid area, and then it remain in the posterior corner, or it can extend into the infratemporal fossa. So our approach mainly depends on whether we go anterior approach, or we can go from below, or we can go from laterally from the lateral approach. So once we know the extent of the tumor by imaging, we mainly for the smaller size or the medium sized tumor, the tumor going limited to the 3A means it is going destroying the skull base, going intracranial, but is very limited, can approach endoscopically. Whereas for the larger tumor, where it has extended laterally, extension is much like the 2C last lateral extension, or if it has gone into 3B type, then we have to go open approach, and that is the preferred approach for us. Also, if there is a last infiltration of tumors into the skull base, into the basisphenoid, open approach is preferred, because this area where it is attached, once we remove the tumor, the bleeding will occur from that attachment site. Extensive, if there is an extensive vascularity from the internal carotid artery system, open approach is preferred. Also, the tumor which has got encasement of the ICA, and we also, for the tumor which is gone intracranially, whether tumor is lying medial to the internal carotid artery or lateral to the internal carotid artery, our approaches will remain. If it is medial, then we prefer to go medial approach. If it is lateral to internal carotid artery, then we go bilateral approaches. So there are different external approaches. This lateral ionotomy is the anterior approach, and transpalatal is the inferior approach to the palate. But these are for the limited tumors, which we used to practice before, but now it has been already substituted by the endoscopy approach. Whereas for the medium-sized tumors, we prefer to go by the transmaxillary approach. That means we remove the anterior maxillary wall, posterior maxillary wall, and then go into the infratemporal fossa. This can be via by going through the skin, that is a Weber-Ferguson incision, or midfacial degloving. Like we can go through the Weber-Ferguson incision or midfacial degloving. The issue with transmaxillary is, since we remove the anterior maxillary wall and posterior maxillary wall, since all these patients are in the growing age group, there is a concern of maxillary hypoplasia in a later age. So we prefer for very large tumors what approach known as a maxillary swing. That means we would like to take the whole of the maxillary sinus based on the cheek flap and then swing it laterally so that we expose the infratemporal fossa. So for that, we need to give a cuts in the frontal process of the maxilla, zygomatic process, and the anterior alveolus. So once we swing it like this, we can expose the infratemporal fossa as well as the pterygopalatine fossa, and the whole of the nasopharynx can be exposed. So this is how the exposure we get it from the maxillary approach. So next part is the endoscopic approach that Dr. Hitesh will be presenting about.
Good afternoon. So endoscopic and minimal invasive surgery indication up to initial stage of 3A, it's possible. For execution of endoscopic procedure, we need better visualization and advanced specialized instruments. For better visualization, we have advanced monitor, camera, and different angles endoscopes. And for surgical execution, we have sophisticated instruments like coblation, microdebrider, endoscopic drill, and some specialized customized instrument like endoscopic cautery. And for hemostasis, we have flow seal and Surgicel, Surgiforms, and gel forms for better hemostasis. So here's a video where this is a case of 2C-JNA. For any vascularized tumor, initial step is exposure and control of the feeder. So here for exposure, middle turbinate lower half was removed, and mucosa was and exposure by removing the uncinate process, anterior and posterior ethmoidectomy, and then creation of the space around the tumor. It's a superior exposure here. Medial exposure is going on. So tumor is attached with the septum, so its plane is created subperiosteally in between the tumor and septal bone. Then the next step is the creation of the inferior space by removing the uncinate process by removing the inferior turbinate, and then comes a lateral exposure. This is a maxillary sinus and wide middle meatus enteroscopy. Removal of the posterior wall of the maxilla. This is a removal of the posterior wall of the maxilla, and then subperiosteal dissection. This tumor was quite large for endoscopic removal, so tumor split was done at the level of the sphenopalatine foramen because it's the narrowest part. So first part was removed, and then this is the first part. First part is removed, and then after the removal of the second part, this is the clips which we applied in the region of the in the region of infratemporal fossa, and this is the endoscopic drill which we use to drill the remnant of lies within the Vidian canal. And these are the hemostatic materials, for example, Surgicel, and then this is the hemostasis which we can see. Then this is a Surgiform, and now we have commercially available less adhesive nasal packing material, so the chances of rebleeding after the removal of the plaque is less. So surgical surgery is possible both in piecemeal or in complete in toto excision, but principle is a complete removal of the tumor is must. And advantages are it's a cosmetic and it allows better visualization because of advanced instrument. And this is our latest publication where we compare the older technique with the recent recent technique, both endoscopically performed. So recent instruments like plasma ablation, which is a coblation, which shows relatively better result as compared to the older instrument. Now I will call Dr. Professor Smith.
At the very outset, I would like to thank the Department of ENT, Professor Alok Thakkar, Professor Rakesh for the kind invitation. And when I'm standing here, I look back 20 years ago when I had hair on my head, and I really thank Dr. Professor A.K. Mahapatra and Professor Sudhir Bahadur, who actually pushed us to be what collaboration that we have now. And we were working together since the last couple of decades. We could have worked more, but I think we were too pressed in our own works, brain and ENT in our own confines. So when we talk about juvenile nasal angiofibroma, it is a very definite entity. 20 years ago, when I used to talk about it abroad, and people used to say, no, it never has an intracranial extension. And then there was people were talking about extradural involvement. And then the main problem is not extradural. It doesn't go into the brain. The problem is it goes into the cavernous sinus. And there are a lot of lacunae in literature. What are the various routes that this intracranial invasion occurs? How does it behave differently in different people? Is it because blood supply differs? And are there tailored surgical approaches? And we actually evolved. By our combined approaches and by our mistakes, and we learned a lot. The traditional classifications that were mentioned earlier do not classify the intracranial GNAs. It's just 3A and 3B. The latest, the UPMC group, classifies into a medial and a lateral extension with or without any residual vasculature. When we talk about intracranial extensions, there are three types. The type 1, it destroys the plenum, goes in the cranial fossa. The type 2, okay, this is working. Type 2 goes through the superior orbital fissure, and that is the true paracellar. And the type 3 is the one which is temporal, infratemporal extension, that is greater wing of sphenoid gets destroyed. When you talk about the real paracellar, the dangerous part, which Ashu was describing about in the radiology, it is the type 2 intracranial GNA. It is a unique subset. It has a mixed vasculature from the ECA, the accessory middle meningeal artery, from the internal maxillary artery, and from the ICA. And it's the infralateral trunk as well, which directly comes in from the cavernous sinus. We actually learned and we realized that if there's a predominant ECA supply from the middle meningeal artery, preoperative embolization is remarkable. It's life-saving actually. And we used to go for a maxillary swing. And then we realized that these tumors, we were leaving a lot of tumors in the cavernous sinus. And a couple of these patients actually bled in the post-operative, and then we had to go back again. And then we actually learned from there and that the ICA supply was a very predominant in these cases. And we actually started the subtemporal transcavernous, a pre-auricular incision. And I thank Dr. Alok for that. And that was these are the, so one of the fellows, Dr. Kiruba, he's an ENT surgeon from Coimbatore. 2 years ago, he was a ENT skull-based fellow. And he analyzed 199 patients of angiofibromas, out of which 42 had stage 3B extension of the paracellar. And he found that 25 had nasomaxillary swings and 17 had subtemporal transcavernous approaches. When we compared the two, the mean blood loss was similar. The operating time was much less, and the hospital duration was much less in the nasomaxillary swing because we were not opening the cavernous sinus because the vasculature was, we thought that vasculature was predominantly external carotid, but we were leaving some tumors, you see. And if you the pre-auricular, when we were opening the cavernous sinus and taking off the supplies, we were leaving very less tumors, and the patients did very good post-operatively. So this is the pre-auricular subtemporal transcavernous approach, in which the standard temporal incision goes down the ear, in front of the ear, and we make a single piece frontotemporal orbital zygomatic craniotomy. Here we expose and open the anterior cavernous sinus, peel off the anterior cavernous sinus, and we take off the anterior clinoid process. So we have the optic nerve, the third nerve, the first, second, and the third divisions of the trigeminal, the ganglion. This is the area that we've been talking about, the superior orbital fissure. And it actually invades into that, it presses into the cavernous sinus. It usually never engulfs the carotid. It actually, there are lobules that go around the carotid. And this is a surgery that we did, I think, last couple of years ago when Dr. Kiruba was there. This doesn't go forward, so you'll have to bear with me. So this was a 3B. So we separate the dura, this is the temporal dura, being separated from the temporal base at the area of the superior orbital fissure. So this is under the microscope. This is the neurosurgical part, and we have already opened the preauricular infratemporal fossa, and Dr. Alok is on the other side. And this is, we have taken off the anterior clinoid process, divided the temporal duplicature. We are peeling the two layers of the cavernous sinus, and here we are drilling the lateral wall of the superior orbital fissure. That is the orbit, to orient you all. Orbit, the temporal dura, the frontal dura. So now the meningo-orbital band is identified, that is divided. The complete ACP is drilled. The temporal base is drilled down. This doesn't scroll, so it's a window system. Sorry. So now we are drilling temporal base, exposing the V2 and then the V3. So that's the foramen rotundum, and then that will be the foramen spinosum and the foramen ovale. We have seen that the tumor bulge is usually between V1 and V2, but sometimes the V2 is involved and it actually erodes this part of the temporal base. And now we are peeling off, that's the tumor bulge, you can see that, between the orbit and the V2. And we are separating the two layers of the cavernous sinus. And now we see that there's a meningeal layer and that's a membranous layer. And now we actually open the membranous layer so that the nerves, the cranial nerves, the third, fourth are not stretched. The third, fourth would be down here, up here, and the V2 would be down there. Now the membranous layer would be open because it is the membranous layer which will have the supplies from the infralateral trunk and the meningeal branches of the meningohypophyseal trunk. And then that is the tumor under my dissector, under my suction, and my dissector is taking off the membranous layer. And now we coagulate and divide these feeders. It is important because you cannot just pull out these tumors. You will avulse the branches of the cavernous ICA and create a disaster. So that now these branches can be divided. And once they are divided, you can actually push the tumor down. And that they'll be bleeding from the cavernous sinus. We use hematocell saver, and there are some cases like flow seal that really helps here. But we never inject flow seal directly in the cavernous sinus. We had hypertension in 2 cases, so we avoid doing that. We just put it on a gel foam and pack it inside, and now we are pushing it down. While we are doing this, Dr. Alok, with his long, slender fingers, is doing a lot of finger dissection in the infratemporal fossa. And that is the bulge that was going in the cavernous sinus. We packed that, and we have separated the tumor which is bulging into the cavernous sinus. So ICA is safe, and that is Dr. Alok down here, and it's pleasure to watch finger dissection. We cannot do it in the brain, so but it's nice. So this tumor is taken off immediately, and then we take off the attachment of the pterygoid plates. And the tumor is gone. So this is just to show the complete resection of a few cases. This was another one, these are usually giant ones going into that's a post-operative MRI, another one, and another one. So GNAs with intracranial extension are basically extradural extension with cavernous sinus extension is a very challenging entity. And they have blood supplies always from ECA and most of the time from IC as well. Preoperative embolization, especially from the ECA, is life-saving. It really helps us to take care of a lot part of the tumor because it's only the 5% of the tumor which goes in the cavernous sinus. Complete excision, which over the last 8-10 years we've learned, minimal morbidity and mortality can be achieved using appropriate collaborative skull-based preauricular subtemporal transcavernous approaches. Thank you.
Good evening all. I'll be discussing the recent imaging, which is the functional imaging for juvenile angiofibroma. Though we have many recent advances in the structural imaging, what is the need for functional imaging? The structural imaging has problem in the specific identification of residual or the recurrent tumors because the contrast enhancement is also seen in the post-surgical reparative tissue or fibrosis or inflammatory conditions. And further, if there is no any residual mass in the first post-operative scan, the risk of subsequent recurrence is less. And for this, the functional imaging, if it targets only the tumor, it can offer a promise of greater accuracy and can avoid potential morbidities to the patient. So our hypothesis was, since JNA is very vascular, we need some tracers which targets the neovasculature. As of now, we have 2 tracers, which is the prostate-specific membrane antigen and somatostatin receptors, which targets the neovasculature, not the normal vasculature. So to prove this hypothesis, we did PSMA PET-CT and Dodonok PET-CT in 2 patients of angiofibroma, and we found excellent uptake in the tumor. Though in PSMA we also had physiological uptake in these salivary glands, the Dodonok had uptake only in the pituitary and head and neck. So we registered the clinical trial to proceed these findings, and we did a pilot study in 25 cases of PSMA PET-CT in primary JNAs. The important findings was all the cases demonstrated PSMA expression. The physiological uptake was also noted in these salivary glands, the recently described tubarial salivary glands too. And none of the tumor had a SUV max value more than the salivary glands, indicating there is no role of therapy using these radiotherapies. And the advanced stage tumors were having more uptake and younger tumors were more. So indicating these advanced stage and younger tumors were more angiogenic. So is this uptake clinically relevant? So now we started comparing the structural imaging findings with the functional imaging findings. This is the patient, interesting patient. He was operated 30 years back, and he had one episode of severe headache and decreasing vision, for which an MR was done outside, and he was labeled as a residual lesion. And we did PET CT where there was no functional uptake, and directed biopsy at this site revealed only inflammatory tissue. Similar the case, this case initially operated with maxillary swing, was operated outside, and a second approach was done endoscopically. The PET scan was done before the surgery, and separate tissues were sent from the sphenoid sinus, which showed tumor, and the rest of the area which showed only fibrosis. This patient after surgery developed a visual loss from 6/12 to 6/60. Had it been we followed this finding of only the sphenoid sinus, we would have avoided this scenario. So we also assessed in the comparison the MR with the PSMA PET CT, where we found MR was oversensitive, but it's very less specific, whereas PSMA PET CT was 100% specific and it was biopsy proven. This was another application where we found the residual uptake, post-contrast uptake in the tumor, but it was not uptake, and PSMA PET CT fusion helped in stereotactic radiotherapy delivery. So the similar concepts also apply for the somatostatin receptor expression in angiofibroma. We have not compared the differences between Dotanoff PET and PSMA PET because it is unethical to do a PET CT for a single patient twice with same implications. So the current issues regarding the PET CT imaging is functional imaging is not available in all centers as of now. There are considerable costs involved, and there is also a risk of radiation exposure in these children. However, we limited the dose to 1/5. The usual dose is 10 millicurie, and we took only scans limited to head and neck, as is a benign disease and it doesn't metastasize. So the proposed application based on functional imaging and a primary setting, due to the cost, universal uptake and the radiation risk, it is not advised. And this is our publication recently, which is accepted in December 2020 issue, where we found that MR is 100% sensitive. So if the first MR imaging is normal, then you need not go for a functional imaging. If MR is suspicious or it shows a definite residual lesion, the exact tumor delineation and the precise extension, and in case you want to deliver a radiotherapy, it might be of useful. The future directions will be a need for a change in the MRI criteria for labeling the residual lesions, theranostics with a futuristic possible tracer which targets only the tumor tissue, and the implementation of the Paris Protocol. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu. So Dr. Suri just showed you how in current days we are handling an angiofibroma, which is, let us say, challenging enough to be in the cavernous sinus and next to the ICA. And because of the initial embolization and the hypertensive anesthesia and the cell saver, that we can actually go down and handle such kind of situations. But back in the days when Professor Rakesh and I sort of joined this department, and when operating theaters were more dramatic places than operating rooms of today, we were usually using the transperital approach. So in the transperital approach, of course, this was something which we used for every patient because that was the only tumor we could see. We didn't quite have CT scans at that era. And though we called them nasopharyngeal angiofibromas, we subsequently came to discover that this was far more than just the nasopharynx. But in those days, when tumors used to be plucked out of the nasopharynx, so to say, there could be difficult times and there could be disasters because naturally there were tumors which were beyond the nasopharynx and you didn't quite detect it or know of it because the X-rays didn't quite pick up that extension. So the game changer was also the CT scans, but even before the CT scan era, this department had sort of come round to the point that this was not quite a nasopharyngeal tumor, but probably a tumor in the pterygomaxillary fissure, and this was Dr. Tandon and Dr. Bahadur who sort of went on to make the point that rather than use the transperital approach, perhaps we should be using the transfacial or the anterior approach, and to go on to say that that would give better access to where we needed to go to. Subsequently, as radiology got even better, and of course scans came in, we realized that this was not quite a pterygomaxillary fissure itself, but perhaps even behind it into the Vidian. And because it was in the pterygoid canal or the Vidian canal, same thing, and often had feeders from the Vidian artery and was probably a tumor which was at the interface between the ICA and the ECA first arch vascular supply, and was therefore positioned at the junction of the Vidian artery, at the junction of the Vidian canal mouth in the pterygomaxillary fissure. So accordingly, we have moved on from the transbrachial approach to the, of course, the transfacial approach, and then on to what we do today, primarily because of greater understanding. And this today is really what we tend to do. It's fairly basic for the past 2 decades, I would say at least 1.5 decades, that we sort of pre-surgical optimization with anti-antigen treatment to shrink the tumor, embolization, of course, to devascularize the tumor. This also was something which didn't quite happen in those days, and Dr. Seth took a lot of interest in the early days to get this going. Now it's so routine that I think your residents do it more than you do it. But and then of course the surgical aspect, wherein again it's been fairly well brought out that once you get adequate exposure and you control the vascular supply and you know where it is exactly attached, then it's fairly easy to control it. So fairly simple principles. One, of course, to get surgical approach as per tumor extensions, and we use all these approaches today. The endoscopic, the midfacial degloving. The midfacial degloving has taken over the lateral rhinotomy approach because you don't quite need a facial incision. And then the transpetal approach, which is very unusual today. And then for intracranial disease, generally we'd use one of these, the maxillary swing or the preauricular approach that Dr. Suri told you about. So one is adequate exposure, 2 is control of vascular supply, which basically means the internal maxillary artery. This is a fairly old time picture which shows us tying the internal maxillary artery. Nowadays we tend to clip it with our endoscopes. And then a centripetal dissection, because as Dr. Sikar told you, the tumor actually attaches only to a very small part of the pterygoid base, and which is where it is attached to the bone, and which is where it gets a second blood supply from the Vidian artery or from the intracranial portion. So as long as you're aware of this and you leave this to the last, when you have appropriate access and exposure to get to that area, you can generally do a safe dissection. And lastly, once we are done, we are now fairly clear that the tumor comes from the Vidian canal, and so it makes sense to change the tumor in the Vidian canal and perhaps drill it out a little bit, because this is where recurrences usually come from. So with the advances which have sort of come through with anesthesia and radiology and now nuclear medicine, we do much better than we used to do in that era. Not to say that they were doing badly, but this is my personal series for a 10-year period till 2013, which just goes to show that all kinds of approaches are used depending on which approach, depending on the extent of the tumor. And I noticed that as we have moved on to current times, I haven't quite been doing as many endoscopic and midfacial degloving approaches, because now Dr. Rakesh and Dr. Hitesh and frankly everybody does more of those, and I have sort of been restricted more and more to the swings and the preauricular approach, and also we are getting far more recurrent tumors than we used to get previously. We still get recurrences. There was a time where I was living in the delusion that we don't get recurrences, but when Dr. Seth started with MRs for follow-ups, we obviously started to find our recurrences coming through. It is my own impression that our recurrences are maximal with the preauricular approach, primarily because it is these are the more extensive tumors, and also because I think you don't quite get access to the Vidian canal to be able to drill that area when you come laterally. And we have sort of moved away a little bit from it because of this issue, and also because it led to invariable loss of the V2 when we were using the preauricular approach. So not that we don't use it, but if it's an ambivalent situation, we would rather use a maxillary swing. And as I said, MRs showed us the recurrences, and we started to worry about having too many recurrences, and getting a functional scan with the PSMA and now the Dotanoc has helped in now become a little bit more specific. So because the MR can show you some pathology in the PNS, it's never quite sure as to whether it's inflammation or tumor, and of course we're getting better and better with the MR. But by using these scans, we can actually, by using the functional scan, we can actually now differentiate between inflammatory change and edema in the post-op period. So that, I think, is what we are doing currently, and it is nice to see that Dr. Seth is also competitive on it and wants to go ahead and find MR protocol so that she can be as specific as the PSMS can, and science is moving forward. So thank you.